Hi all, today we'll discuss top 50 JPA with a Spring Boot real-time interview question with the answers. So what all are the common JPA interview questions with the Spring Boot? So here we have what is JPA and how does it relate to Hibernate? Why we are using JPA and how it does it relate to the Hibernate? So this is the proper appropriate answers in there. So what is JPA and how we will relate with the Hibernate? The next question is what is a Spring Data JPA? So what is the difference between JPA, Spring Data, JPA now? And explain the concept of entity in JPA. So what is the use of at the rate entity in JPA annotation? So how do you define a primary key in JPA? So we have at the rate ID, at the rate generated value. So these all are the annotations. How do you define the primary key in a JPA? The next is what is the purpose of at the rate entity annotation? Why we are using at the rate entity annotation? How can you customize a table name for the entity in JPA? So if you want to customize the table name for the entity in JPA, at the rate tables we have annotations. So based on the tables, we need to define the custom table name. So what is the difference strategy for the primary key generation in JPA? So the strategy include auto, identity, sequence, tables, using at the rate generated value. So at the rate generated annotation is there, through that we will do. Now next question is explain this at the rate column annotation. What is the use of at the rate column annotation? The next is what is entity manager in JPA? How we will create a CRUD based applications in JPA by using this. The next is how do you define one-to-one relationship in JPA? So we have a one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many like this. So we have a annotation with at the rate one-to-one annotations for the relationship of JPA. How do you implement one-to-many? So we have one-to-many annotation is there. How do you describe this many-to-many relationship? So we have a many-to-many annotation is there. What is the purpose of join table? So at the rate join tables, it is used to define the join of tables many to many relationship or customized join tables and all. So what is JPA repository? So what is JPA repository? And the next question is how do you create a custom query in JPA? How do we create a custom query in Spring Data JPA? So we can create at the rate query annotations we will use and create a custom query. Explain the difference between fetch. Fetch type is a lazy and fetch type is a eager. So when to use as a eager and when to use as a lazy fetch type. What is the JPQL? What is JPQL in JPA? So Java Persistence Query Language. When to use this? And the next is what is named query in JPA? At the rate named query annotations also we are using. So the next is how do you handle transaction in JPA? So while we handle the transaction at the rate transactional annotations is there, through that we are handling. And the next question is what is the difference between entity manager merge and entity manager persist? The next question is cascaded type in JPA. What is cascaded type in JPA? The next question is what is the purpose of at the rate embeddable annotations? When to use embeddable annotations? Next question is how do you map a composite key in JPA? What is composite key? So at the rate embeddable and when to use composite key. What is the difference between entity inheritance strategy in JPA? Entity inheritance strategy. What is mapped superclass? At the rate mapped superclass. How do you enable auditing in Spring Data JPA? Auditing. So this auditing, we have a create dates and all, last date and all. What is the purpose of at the rate modifying annotation? What is the purpose of entity graph in JPA? How do you perform pagination in the Spring Data JPA? And what the next question is, what is at the rate query annotations used for the Spring Data JPA? Explain the entity manager factory and its role. What is entity manager factory and what is the role of that? The next question is, what is at the rate element collections in JPA? Next question is, how do you handle optimistic locking in JPA? What is criteria query and JPQL? What is the difference between criteria query and JPQL? What is the purpose of at the rate transient annotation? And how do you implement batch processing in a Spring Data JPA? What is detached entity in JPA? And how do you handle lazy loading exception in JPA? What is the role of persistence context in JPA? And how do you configure secondary data source in a Spring Boot with JPA? Secondary data source. And explain the use of at the rate cacheable annotations in JPA. So why you use for the cacheable annotations? What is the role of persistent unit in JPA? What is at the rate persistent annotation? How do you handle native query in JPA? And what is the difference between mapped superclass and embeddable? The next question is, what is lazy initialization exception and how do you resolve it? The next question is, explain the concept of orphan removal in JPA. What is orphan removal in JPA? The next question is, how do you audit change entity in Spring Data JPA? How you will change the audit? What is the purpose of SQL result set mapping annotation? So we have at the rate SQL result set mapping annotation. What is the use of that? And the next question is, how do you handle bidirectional relationship in Spring Data JPA? And the next question is, what is the role of JPA repository in Spring Data JPA? So these all are the common JPA related interview questions. So if you prepare this all interview questions, top 50 JPA interview questions with the Spring Boot, apart from this, no other questions the interviewer will ask. Only these all are the common things we are using on real time scenarios while we are developing with the Spring Boot with JPA. So if you want, you can prepare these all, and also you can prepare the notes also for this based on these questions and all. Yeah, thank you.